Welcome back, I'm Annisa Omar. This Wednesday saw many Britons and other nationalities around the world mark Remembrance Day to honour and commemorate the victims and soldiers of First World War and the following conflicts. We ask how Africans contributed to the war effort, and Adam Manunu has this for us.
The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. This time every year, Britain commemorates the end of the First World War, also known as the Great War, remembering the brutality that soldiers faced, victims and destruction. All over the UK, people stood. A 2-minute silence was held in Trafalgar Square on Wednesday by people from all walks of life and backgrounds, including those who had served Britain in previous conflicts. In Australia, soldiers who had fought were also honoured with the playing of the didgeridoo. An event attended by Prince Charles and the Duchess of Cornwall. Until recently, there has been much emphasis on the role of the great European powers, Britain, France, Germany and Russia, who were seen as the main players of what was the first modern and global war of the 20th century. The image of British, French and Russian victors of the war and subsequent wars as heroics and champions does permeate the minds of many within British society. A world war we call it, and stories of the conditions of the trenches brings horror and melancholy to one's mind. But what made it truly a world war? Britain's empire, which at the time made up a quarter of the world's population, was heavily involved. The idea of Britain's empire partaking in the war is hardly discussed, as well as the reasons as to why there was this large-scale participation. This is what some people had to say on the streets as to why they thought many within the Commonwealth participated in the war.
Back then, if you're from a poorer background, the army's would seem to be a great idea.
I think the troops 100 years ago came together because they knew how important it was for Britain to stand together as one with other nations to help each other.
Along with soldiers from India and from the Caribbean, Africans from many countries served with the Allied forces during the First World War as frontline troops and in other additional roles, such as porters. Participants came from Nigeria, the Gambia and Rhodesia, now known as Zimbabwe, South Africa, Sierra Leone, Uganda and Nyasaland, now known as Malawi, Kenya and the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana. Many were active soldiers, taking part in campaigns to capture German-controlled territories of Togo, Cameroon, German Southwest Africa, now known as Namibia, and German East Africa, now known as Tanzania. On the vast savanna plains of Kenya's Taita Taveta, Mwamkono Mwavaka's grandfather Chokolo was forced to serve as a porter for the British Army. A lock of his hair returned home as proof of death, but even in the midst of this, males from his family were taken away as a replacement to fight in the war.
Lipoletwa nywele, wale wengine nao wakamshika mtoto yake.
When his hair was brought back, the others grabbed his son and took him away. Then people said, his own father has died over there. Now this one will also go to die over there. So people were really distraught.
55,000 African men served as armed soldiers and many hundreds of thousands more as carriers and supplementary troops. Such troops included the Askari, local soldiers serving particularly in the African Great Lakes, Northeast Africa and Central Africa. They played a crucial role in the conquest of the various colonial possessions and subsequently served as garrison and internal security forces. An estimated 10,000 African soldiers were killed or died whilst serving. At the time, there were 30 million subjects in the African colonies of the British Empire.
Joining me to discuss this is Dr. Peter Johnston from the National Army Museum. We also have Selena Carty, who is the founder of the Black Poppy Rose campaign. Thank you for coming in, guys.
Thank you.
So, Peter, why is it that Africans were fighting in the World War I?
They fought for a lot of reasons, really. Unlike other countries, actually, there was no conscription in any of Britain's African colonies at all. So people volunteered for service. They did this for a variety of reasons. I mean, it's quite complicated and it depended on the individual, but it might have been because for better pay, it may have been because their friends had joined, it may have been the perceived glamour of soldiering, it may have been just to provide and receive a steady income of food, or they may have lofty political ambitions and said that if we serve, then perhaps our nation will receive greater political recognition from the British in return as a sense of gratitude. So a real myriad of reasons why people volunteered to take part.
And what did you think of the thoughts in the video as to why people fought? Do you think it was primarily a freedom, sort of a bargaining?
It's difficult to say, really. As I said, the reasons really depend on each individual. Sadly, we don't have a huge record about why some people joined up. I think what the VT and what the film showed us as well is that even today it's still a very contentious issue, and what we at the National Army Museum are very keen to do is to really spark conversations about that. We want to engage in dialogue with people, we want to hear their thoughts.
In terms of the African effort in World War I, can you paint us a picture? What countries were involved in? And how many people are we talking? Hundreds of thousands, or from the Gold Coast to what we know now as South Africa? What is the picture?
It's really exactly that. It's across the continent entirely. The British have soldiers recruited from West Africa, from East Africa, from South Africa. Then, of course, there's the French who recruit heavily from their own colonies in North Africa as well. So you have a huge mobilisation of the human resource of the continent to fight in these places and in these countries. The first shots of the war, for example, are fired on the 7th of August in Togoland, or what was Togoland, by RSM Grunshi, who is served for the Gold Coast Regiment in the British Army. A lot of people don't know that. That's nearly 2 weeks before the first shots are fired in Europe of the First World War. So it's important that we do talk about the role that these people played.
So Selena, can you give us an idea as to why is it, do you think, that African people and the black people on the wider scale fought within World War I? Do you think it is, as Peter's putting forward, a voluntary, and there is one argument. There is also the argument that it was a bargaining tool for freedom. What are your thoughts?
I think it can be both of those, but it goes back further than before the First World War, because in 1884, 1885, European countries had colonised Africa and had divided it amongst themselves, hence why you have French West Africa, hence why you have the German colonies and the British colonies. So when the World War came, people were serving their countries. They were serving the countries that they were loyal to, and nobody would want to see their home destroyed or people that they represented to be under fire. So when it came to war, we were serving for our country and we were serving for the betterment of the empires.
And in terms of your Black Poppy Rose campaign, could you tell us a little bit about that?
I could. So we're trying to remember the African, Black, Caribbean contributions to wars, and we go back to 500 years because there's been wars throughout history. However, when we get to the 16th century, we're still able to see African civilizations like Songhai, Mali, and after that time we've got the colonizations on the west coast and eventually throughout Africa. And at that time, our history becomes combined with European history. And what we're trying to do is draw out the African history and African contributions from those times to now. Say we have the 7-year wars in the West Indies. Not many people remember that the West Indies was colonized before the African continent, of which England, France and the Dutch were monopolizing on the islands there to be able to get the resources and things. And then we go on to say like the Napoleonic Wars, Haitian Revolution, Crimean War.
Educating me, you really are. So to Peter, in terms of education, do you think, how Selena's educating me, do you think there needs to be perhaps a wider, within the national British curriculum, or visiting the National War Museum? How do you think that young people, particularly from black and ethnic minorities, can learn more about their history?
I think it's really important that we do, because as much as Selena said, it's shared history. It's not just one person's history, it's a history of conflict in which everybody played their part. There are a lot of ways you can do that. You can visit our website at nam.ac.uk and you can see on there's a whole load of learning resources about the First World War. You can see a lot of videos, for example, that we've produced about the different theatres that people fought in, that it wasn't just about France and Belgium and the Western Front, it was far more diverse than that. And also you can read a lot more about the individual stories of some people that took part as well. See some photographs of the time, of some quite stunning and remarkable photographs of places like Southwest Africa of the period at the beginning of the 20th century that are really quite remarkable.
And bringing it back to the African experience, how was it different in terms of, it wasn't going in the trenches, particularly the East Africa campaign, which was one of the longest. It was more sort of long terrains that people were travelling on in obviously hot conditions, and we're talking sort of 150,000 people, I think, were in that one campaign. Can you paint a little picture as to what was going on in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're quite right. The dominant image of the First World War is the trenches and the mud and the rain and the water, whereas in the East African campaign, it's a completely different environment, and as all environments, it's a war against the environment as much as against the enemy as well. It's bush warfare, it's hot, it's tropical, it's difficult to move, enormously long logistical chains which make things extremely difficult as well to keep troops supplied. Disease is a major factor and actually results in 30 times more casualties than combat action, which in itself is quite remarkable as well. Very, very difficult environment to fight in and to keep going. And
do you think there are enough records of all the African soldiers that had partaken in such a campaign, or do you think it's because they were effectively subjects of the colonial empires that their history is not so well kept?
I think it's difficult to say. I think it is sad that we don't know as much about these campaigns and they're not as prominent in the public consciousness as perhaps they should be. The legacy of the experience of the First World War in Africa is tremendous, and it creates a legacy of service that means that come the Second World War, thousands of men sign up for service as far away as Burma, without whom the war in the Far East couldn't have been won. So it's vitally important to Britain's national history, not just the history of the First World War, but 20th century history.
Well, in World War II, do you think that there wasn't enough there too, and that there wasn't enough record keeping in terms of linkages as well?
I think we're better with the Second World War, fortunately more with things like the drive to independence that follows the end of the Second World War, a lot of Britain's colonial empire. People captured this a little bit more, whereas perhaps the First World War was just seen as one part of colonial history.
Probably didn't even know, it was going to happen. It was a world war, and it's sort of just... So there is that argument too, but in terms of people remembering here within not only diaspora, but just the wider British and other colonial former states, I think it is important to keep those records. And with your campaign, Selena, would you say that is one of the main ethoses of it?
It certainly is, because war doesn't happen by chance. So there are a lot of things that have to be put in place before war can take place, and this is what we've been learning about. So if people go to www.blackpoppyrose.org, be able to share more and get more information about the laws that would have been in place, like the National Aliens Act in 1914, which was revised again in 1918, which would prohibit the amount of aliens in terms, people of colour, could join battalions in the United Kingdom unless they had a grandfather born to this country. And then as we go throughout the wars, we look at the different laws and different changes throughout Africa, the West Indies and the rest of the world, and how people of colour were marginalised within the warfare.
So you think we've effectively been written out of history to some
Well,
regard?
I don't think we've been written out. I just think we've been written over. Because,
okay.
sorry, the documents are there. So it's just about how we
bringing them
forward. Yeah, and this is what the Black Poppy Rose campaign is about.
And what else is the campaign about in terms of giving back to younger communities in understanding where we come from? Do you think it's very important?
Very. We're trying to look at and home in on identity, because I'm a family tree genealogist, so I help people to trace their trees and their lines. And if you can't find your line, then we look at history to look at what peoples in that area would have been doing. And when you're looking at young people, they want to know how they belong here. They want to know what their ancestors have contributed and how things have gone on. So what we're trying to do is give them a story that includes them, that makes them feel that they're a part of that, because we all have a connection to history, and it's about how we are able to tell our story and how we are able to put it out there so other people can learn.
Different platforms now.
Because history is about empowerment.
Social media?
Yes, so Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, Facebook, emails, so we put it all out there. So if you find us, Black Poppy Rose, you'll be able to find a plethora of information that we're trying to bombard out there so people are more aware about the histories that we've had.
So Peter, showing on the video there, World War I's not obviously just about the African experience. There are other Asian and other continents and countries that were involved. Would you say that their experience too has not been given enough light?
I think it varies actually. I mean, people know that the Indian subcontinent provided a huge amount of manpower for Britain to use. I don't think they maybe understand that it was 1.3 million people, which is enormous. At that point, it was the largest volunteer army in history.
Yes.
So again, tremendous, valuable contribution that, again, without which victory couldn't have been secured. Likewise, people from the Caribbean as well, consciously making an effort to actually travel to Britain to volunteer, so much so that the British Army creates its own regiment for the British West Indies Regiment, 15,000 of them. They go on to serve with great distinction in Palestine and Jordan. Again, soldiers from the Caribbean actually serve in Africa as well. In the East African campaign, soldiers of the West India Regiment. So, I think I think we should call it a world war, not just because of the numbers of people they fight, but also where they fight and the huge distances they travel to fight as well. And that's really what makes it a world war and to our view, so worthy of remembrance.
On the British West India Regiment, we recently just laid 14 black poppy rose wreaths to honour the British West India Regiment who were buried in Seaford. So they didn't actually make it to the war front. They were stationed here in training.
You guys are teaching me so much, and I could sit here all day, but moving on to what's going on next. So that's for this episode for Africa of This Week. I want to thank you all, my guests, for joining us, and to you at home for watching. We'll be back next week at the same time. In case you missed the show, a repeat will be aired tomorrow at 4 p.m. You can watch previous episodes on the YouTube channel and send in your comments, suggested topics and videos to the email address on the screen. After a 2-year interruption due to security crisis, the African Biennale of Photography opened in Bamako in Mali early this month. We leave you with scenes of photographs from all around the continent who came to show their work under the theme Telling Time. Some of the works range from narratives of Ebola and migration in North Africa. Have a great evening.